What does it mean to be a disciple? What does it mean to be happy? And how has higher education played a role in kind of twisting culture to where we find ourselves today? We're going to be looking at some big questions in life that we would call worldview and how those things play in. There's going to be a tiny bit of math. So, Martin Luther said, "I greatly fear that the universities, unless they teach the Holy Scriptures diligently and impress them on the young students, are wide gates to hell." So let's look at that. Why did he say that? He knew, just like with what Daniel was facing, when you take the young and the best and you remove morality, you remove virtue from knowledge, things tend to collapse. And so how has the church kind of abdicated the virtue from knowledge? And that's one of the things that we're going to see this weekend that we have some answers for. I read this morning. This just came out today. The number of children with dysphoria has risen 50-fold, 50 times in a decade. How do we kind of figure out how we got down this path? One of the things that we see that's gone on in higher education, even since the 60s, is this promotion of gender dysphoria. When real studies were done at Brown University on gender dysphoria, what they found, it was a social contagion, meaning it was basically peer pressure. Now, what happens when a university publishes research like that stands up against what society, really what they're pushing, is that research itself was shut down. When we look at how this is done, there's a really simple method that the Bible talks about. How do you transform culture? How do you get ideas passed on? And so we read in 2 Timothy 2, and it says, "And these things you," this is Paul speaking to Timothy, "have heard me," this is Paul speaking again, "say in the presence of many witnesses, and trust to reliable people." This could be pastors, teachers, or parents who will be also qualified to teach others. So you see 4 generations. You have kind of like what I'm going to call a subject matter expert is teaching people then who teach. Higher education are the ones who are teaching the teachers. We just heard 16,000 hours is what they spend with these people who have been taught. So I like this meme. I think it actually is appropriate when we think about higher education. It says, "Sheep's clothing is fine, but you need to think bigger." See, a wolf in sheep's clothing is one thing, but a wolf in shepherd's clothing does far more damage. And this is what I would like to kind of address. So the first thing on all of this is I want to get us to use correct language. Where do you send your kids to school? People say this a lot. We need to separate. Schooling is different than education. When we say education, we must not simply think school. School is a place. Education happens all the time. So this was Daisy Air Rifle. We have the Daisy Museum right here in Rogers, Arkansas. And they understood this. And so they said, don't let schooling interfere with your education. The Bible does not use the word schooling or even education. They use terms like learn, train, teach, and disciple. How different would it be if we said, where do you send your kid to be discipled? Where is your college student learning to be discipled? Even the way we frame the question changes the way we think about these things. Hosea 4:6 reads, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because they've rejected knowledge. I reject you from being a priest. And since you have forgotten the law of your God," that's the virtue component, "I will forget your children." There's very little new to these formulas. When we divorce character and morality from education, bad things happen. We do not send, again, our children to school. School is a building. Education preps the mind with knowledge and understanding, the heart with virtue, and the will with wisdom. There's a lot of things that we can understand that are true, but we also need to be training the will for wisdom. How do we apply what we know? So I had a funny thing happen this week when I was thinking about this lecture. My wife and I needed a new mattress, and our go-to for mattress sold his mattress company last year. So we were like, well, we'll go online. And then it got me thinking about something funny. My family and I went to Egypt. This is the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities in Cairo. And we went around there. And one of the most striking things in there, I mean, they had phenomenal things from King Tut and all these other things, was a bed. So this is a bed of the royal architect. His name is Ka. And you can see on the bed, there's a little headrest. That's definitely not my pillow. And I was thinking, are we living better than all of history? Is this the best time to be alive? If you read the tagline for the article, it says overwhelming evidence from across the academic disciplines shows that we are richer, live longer, are better fed, and are better educated. The first thing that happened as I started to look into this research was propaganda. The propaganda was trying to influence what was the data. They want to influence people's opinions and behaviors by direction. One of the things that we see across all disciplines is what can we get people to look at? So I threw up Google. This is kind of hard to see from there. The first thing that's coming up is, well, what you actually want to know, instead of how wealthy people were, is what is wealth distribution or income inequality? And I did this with Copilot, I did this with Grok, just to kind of see what would happen. All of them the same. If you want to know a statistic, are we doing better? They just want you to know income inequality. So we could be doing better than any time in history, but they want you to know someone is doing better than you. Doublespeak. This is, I think, something important for us to understand in all of these conversations on education. What's really important about the world is doublespeak, is the ability to lie, whether knowingly or unconsciously, and to get away with it. The ability to use lies and to shape facts selectively, blocking out those that don't fit into an agenda and program. When you go through college, graduate school, and beyond, what you see is there's this tension all the time. In order to, how is this presented? How do we get this? And what is happening is facts are shaped sometimes, like you said, unconsciously and consciously. Socialism on this vein, and we're going to be using this, just the single vein to look at happiness. Look what Norman Thomas said. This is almost 100 years ago. The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program. So he was a Union Theological University graduate. I believe he taught there as well as Princeton University. He was going after the top people, teaching the teachers how to teach this. So 100 years later, we now have begun through multi-generational discipleship to adapt some of these ideas of socialism. So let's look at the data though. Look at the share of disposable personal income spent on food in the US. Everybody was talking about that, the price of eggs. If you go back not very far, we were spending a significant portion, 17% of our income on food. You compare it to what we're spending it on now. It's far less. That's just going back to the 60s. If you go back further than that, to the 1900s, over 40% of our income was spent just on food. So are we objectively doing better? Yes. But what do they want people to focus on? Inequality. Percent of income spent on housing is roughly bounced around the same rate, 26 to 28% plus and minus 4%. So we've spent the same amount on housing. And you hear young people today can't afford a house. Well, one of the reasons why they can't is if you look at average house size. If you go back and look, even in 1900s, that's a house size of 900 square feet. You go to 1970, and it still is under 1,500 square feet. So even though the housing price has been the same, the size has grown massively. You put them all together, the same trend line shows. We are doing better. How about, are we living longer? Let's look at life expectancy. If you were born prior to 1880, you had a life expectancy of 40 years. We didn't cross the threshold for living past 60 till 1935. FDR was president. We are living longer with more disposable income than any other time in life. Well, what's happening with the poorest of the poor? In economics, we call those who are living in extreme poverty. And this is the chart. The red shows extreme poverty going all the way back to 1900. And when you look at this, almost 90% of the world was in extreme poverty. Now, what do we have today? This one goes to 2015. If we zoom in a little close, are we doing better now than what we were doing? If you look, that is basically 2000. There's a 3.6 times decrease in people living in extreme poverty. Are we hearing any of this in the news? What do we hear about? Who's the problem? Those who have more. The oligarchs that are running the country. All of these things. This is why it's so important. My job here really, for what I want you to get, is I don't need people to understand the facts, the figures, but I want to encourage people to think. What is it that you're allowing in, the propaganda and these things, that is shifting from reality? And the reason I bring this up is because you would think if we were doing better than any time in history, there are less people in extreme poverty, life expectancy has exploded, people are eating better around the world, that we would be plummeting in anxiety, but we find the exact opposite is happening. So this is from 2008 to 2018. In the younger generations, 18 to 25, it's almost doubled the amount of anxiety. What's happened? Income inequality being pushed, higher education, income inequality being pushed to teachers teaching this to the younger generations. I could almost take anything with this. And the same pipeline is going through that method. We need to wake up to what's happening. Major depression in teens, girls, off the charts. This is actual ER visits for non-fatal self-harm. Now look at the ages that we're talking about here, from 10 to 14 years old. There's a 310% increase. What happened in 2010? I'm not saying this is causation, because I can't prove causation, but certainly it correlates. I mean, Instagram came out in 2010. We see a lot of these things that are just dramatically changing. How much does the U.S. spend just in treating mental illness each year? $282 billion. Now, as I say that, I can tell, oh, that's another big statistic. As humans, we're really, really bad at big numbers. I'm going to prove this in just a minute. We're really bad at big numbers. What is $282 billion? You just hear this in the news all the time. Okay, that's what we spent on mental health. That's also the budget of the Chinese military. Does that start to put it in a bigger perspective of what's happening? Facebook's total revenue is about half. And that's not their income, that's total revenue. It's over 10 times all the revenue of every McDonald in the US is what we're spending on mental health. I joked with Joseph today, I said maybe we should spend all that money on McDonald's and people would be happy. So let's look at this thread. I looked at the past to kind of see where we were, so I went back and did some research, and I saw in 1980, they did a study from 1971 to 1980, and it was almost exactly the same amount extra was spent on mental health every year. It was at 1.7%. It went up. If that trend stayed, today it would be at 43 billion, not 282. Now, I know this is multifaceted. When we look at the anxiety, all of the things that are kind of going wrong with what we see in society, all of these challenges, and I'm not going to lay them all at the feet of the same problem. But one of the big problems we had was a result of the sexual revolution that was primarily propagated out of higher education that has had a direct line and an impact on divorce. The greatest, I would say, if you're going to pick any single factor that's going to talk about what we call happiness and human flourishing that I'm going to be getting into, is this tragedy of divorce. Data suggests there is no bigger impact, and there's lots of studies. This is one I had on there. And the U.S. Senate in 2020 noticed the toll that this takes on the economy. And they have if you have time, go look up the demise of the happy two-parent home. And you see that the numbers have absolutely plummeted. We're now below 50%. If you look at percent of births to unwed mothers, it also skyrocketed from 55. So what does that mean for the next generation in discipleship? What does that mean for flourishing? What does that mean for young people to then be able to stand in front of the fiery furnace? Who's training them? These are real problems. Across every income, when you look at people who have kids, you can see those with higher education, percent of births to unwed mothers, it still went up, it doubled. But if you look at middle income, middle America, what I kind of say is this area, and lower income, it is absolutely exploded. We have to have an education solution that somehow can help these areas. Two-parent privilege is a real thing. So 70% of juvenile offenders in the US come from single-parent homes. Children in single-parent homes are 3 times more likely to live at or below the poverty line than their two-parent counterparts. They're 2 to 3 times more likely to experience unmarried pregnancy of their own, a discipleship. They see something and then they follow through with it. High school dropout rates are 3 times higher. You can go down almost every statistic. Now, the one thing that I want to say about these are really difficult areas. I don't purport to, I don't want to even be coy about it. There's those in my family who have had, they're being raised in single parent homes that husbands have been incarcerated. The solutions to these problems require real work. They require sacrifice. They require everything. It's going to require us to reorient our thinking even about children. So what is human flourishing? Wikipedia put human flourishing as positive psychological functioning. That's a fancy way to say you feel good. Positive social functioning, which is true. Humans flourish when they're around other people and they're experiencing love. And they have basic goods. But I want to go back and look at ancient wisdom and especially tie that into what does it mean even in America to have this? And so Aristotle He described what we call human flourishing as eudaimonia. And it's this idea of being a good soul. He tied virtue to being necessary for happiness. So Aristotle believed that pleasure is a byproduct of virtuous action, but not the reason for it. He thought that doing something virtuous can sometimes make you unhappy, like telling a friend an upsetting truth, but true pleasure only comes from virtue. Is happiness then to be blessed or purely feeling pleasure? And this idea of being blessed, this is the same thing that we get like the Beatitudes from. When you look at how our country was founded, this is the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, which among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How is this being taught today? You can do whatever you want to do to feel that. Where did Jefferson, who penned this, get this idea? In fact, originally it was property was in there, in the pursuit of property. And that was John Locke, is literally who he plagiarized this from, who he took it from. He gives credit to him. He wrote an essay, it's actually a book, called Concerning Human Understanding. Locke's major influence on this idea of happiness came from two things: Nicomachean Ethics, which was Aristotle's 10 books on ethics, and the Bible. He had the exact same idea that went into the Declaration of Independence that tied virtue as an understanding to understand happiness. That just serving yourself will never bring about true happiness or a biblical understanding of it. In his book, I'm not going to read the Old English, but here are 3 key takeaways from that. We must distinguish false pleasures which promise immediate gratification but produce long-term pain from true pleasures which are intense and long-lasting. The pursuit of happiness is the foundation of individual liberty. And again, happiness by that definition of virtue tied to happiness, since it gives us the ability to make decisions that are in our long-term best interest. But interestingly, when you go through this, he says the best bet, this is my translation, would be to live a life of virtue so one can win everlasting happiness. Betting on a life of hedonistic pleasure is irrational given the prospect of infinite misery. So what he's looking at is going, truly happy people answer the big questions of life. And we have not taught the next generation what even are the big questions in life, yet alone given them answers. The answers that have been peddled to them are the reason we are in the shape we are. What are the big questions of life? Where did I come from? Who am I? Why do I exist? How should I live my life? And what happens to me when I die? Origin, we talked a little bit about identity, meaning, morality, and destiny. If our origin is that we are part of an intelligent design, we were created, or are we by some random chance? Is our identity as a child of God or our feelings? Meaning, are we here to glorify God or glorify ourselves? Narcissism. Is our morality based on a creator or based on what we want? And will we be judged based on how we live, or is it purely annihilation? Doug Axe had kind of an interesting principle when he looks at, are we created, are we designed, or are we random chance? And kind of go with me on this math. This math is this is a really big number. What he did is he took a single enzyme, it's called beta-lactamase. And by the way, this is not a second-tier scientist. This is someone who is a fellow in microbiology. He's very famous for this research. if you take these amino acids, you have to make a chain, and then this enzyme all has to fold up, and this enzyme helps bacteria break down antibiotics. So it's the reason we have some antibiotic resistance. Now, none of that totally matters. But he said in order to get this enzyme, the chances of it happening on its own is 1 with 77 zeros after it. So it's a really, really big number. So I want to illustrate something, how big that number is with some playing cards. How many playing cards are in a deck of cards? Does anybody know? 52, that's correct. So I don't know, some people have problems with the symbols on there. So I labeled them from 1 to, these are blank, just so we're in a church. If this deck is properly shuffled, what if I told you none of you, given any amount of time, will ever guess how this deck is shuffled? It's impossible. The number is that big. So if I say, what is this card? There's enough people in here, it happens to be a 5. You have a 1 in 52 chance to get it. Now you have a 1 and 51 chance to guess the next card, right? It's 25. Now you have a 1 in 50 chance, right? Okay, so we call that, if you said 52 times 51, 50, and go all the way down, 52 factorial, okay? That is a very big number. So it is 8 with 67 zeros after it. That's how big that number is. Okay? From a single deck of cards. How big is that number? Now, Mega Millions lottery is a big number. If you won the Mega Millions lottery, you would have beaten the odds. I don't know how many winners of the year they are. I didn't look up on it. I just looked at the odds. Now, if you won Mega Millions every time it came out for 10 years, would people accuse you of rigging the lottery? Okay, right? Now, what if you did that for 100 years? Definitely. That would be some intelligence has done that, and they would have to look into why you were winning it. Now, I want you to think about the entire time of the universe that scientists say. I'm not even going to get into the debate of how old the universe is, but it is long. So from scientists say to the Big Bang until now, if you won the Mega Millions lottery 100 billion times a second, if you could, for the entire length of the universe, how many seconds have been in the universe? Then you did that another 100 billion times, you would still be less than 52 factorial. Now let's go back to the enzyme. The enzyme was about 100 times billion less chance than that. And yet they want people to go, you came here. That's a single enzyme in a single cell. I'm not talking about DNA. I'm not talking about things that are complex. I'm talking about a single enzyme. Understanding this is one of the guardrails where we've gotten off when we look at these mental health crises. If you're a child of God, you look at yourself different. If you're willing to stand up and be different. But if you're just a product of materialistic, naturalistic, what hope is there? The most brilliant of atheists who debated this says the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect, except he was wrong about that. No purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So in essence, you are here paying state and federal taxes. So that is kind of depressing.
That is depressing.
But there's such a difference. If we are created in God's image for his glory, we are new creation. We're made in his image. There's no longer condemnation. We're children of God. We're the righteousness of God. There's a comedian, I like how he put it. He said, his name's Brad Stein, he said, self-esteem seems like a great idea, and it sounds good to care about yourself, but where does the esteem come from? If you love yourself based on yourself, it leads to tyranny, ego, and pride. Remember Jesus? He said you must esteem others first. Remember the 10 Commandments? The first commandment to humans was, you must love me first. Why? When the creator of matter says you matter, then you have purpose. Then you have self-esteem. What is higher education peddling? Random chance. So am I surprised after multi-generational of peddling this that we have the crisis of identity that we have the mental health issues that we have the problems we have. If naturalistic evolution is true, people are not equal. Think of the absurdity of our document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's absurd. You take someone tall, athletic, LeBron James or something like that, he and I are completely unequal. No matter how much training I would do, I would never be able to play basketball like that. So what was baked in to this idea? The rough draft said we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. What was the sacred? It was from Scripture. Our identity that we are created equal was tied to a biblical value and a biblical truth. The moment you divorce that into random chance, you have a problem. So people go looking for their identity other ways. Now, a lot of times that doesn't happen in a low information society, but in a high information society, it creates all sorts of actual problems. Social media thrives due to inequality. This impacts youth happiness, and I'm using that in air quotes, not the kind of happiness that comes in doing the right thing, especially relates to identity. And if you look at this, I won't go over all of them, but 1/3 increase in depressive symptoms, or 1/3 increase in roughly suicide rates. The one though that surprised me, and I looked up these articles, was receiving essentially likes, and they looked at positive feedback, brought no additional happiness. It was independent on whether or not someone liked it. And a lot of attention has been done to youth, but I want to also talk about adults. This was from Harvard, Social Media Use and Adult Depression. And it is massively impactful. People like to pretend that it doesn't correlate. And there's a direct correlation to the amount of time versus satisfaction. And Babylon Bee has highlighted this better than I could with data and statistics. Man who just reads news and social media all day, unsure why he's so depressed. Get a load of this ignorant moron who doesn't follow politics and also really happy with his life. But look how much time we're wasting. So the article, this is an international article, but it says it's worse in the US, instead of the 17 hours. Americans spend an average of 7 hours, 3 minutes online a day. This includes video games, YouTube, social, this is online, so I want to be clear about that. Exceeding 18 years of their adult lives. Why do I exist? I can tell you, you do not exist to be online 7 hours a day. Literally, almost anything would be better. I mean, exercise, going for a walk, sleeping, reading a book, anything would be better. We are created for his workmanship to do good works. We're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, people for his possession, that we may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you into the darkness for marvelous light. So we are created for a purpose. Higher education has been telling us your random chance, all of these things. And what happens is we end up amusing ourselves to death. There's a great book by that same title called Amusing Ourselves to Death. One of the things with this is I do think this is a byproduct of sexual revolution and a lot of these things is we've become so desensitized that our brains need this. When you look at the neurobiology, you take programs like CocoMelon. CocoMelon shifts even to the young brain. They don't have a scene that stays longer than 3 seconds. It's in bright primary colors. And it grabs kids' attention like no other thing. If you want to have some fun, look at like CocoMelon is evil. And this is not done by Christians. This is done by neurobiologists. Because they understand the power of not allowing for just rest and communication. Most of us in here have heard of secondhand smoke. And we know the ills. And we're like, if a parent smokes in the presence of their child, the impact it has on them. What a lot of people are looking at right now is something called displacement theory. This highlights the time that's spent on screens, internet, social media, pornography, video games, that otherwise historically would have been spent on real social interactions like child rearing, marriage enhancement, reading, hobbies, exercise, and general learning. I have seen so many parents, the child come up, and they don't even set their phone down. And this picture, I think, represents this so well. We've been so conditioned by society to say, we're not going to be different. We're going to look our child in the eye. We are going to give someone else something that we just kind of ignore the realities. And so displacement happens. So am I surprised when I see kids in restaurants who can't, they have to have a screen. When I see moms at a park, they'll literally be talking to other moms on their phone, looking to see what the pictures they posted when their kids are doing that. I'll see dads can't look away from sports. We are suffering as a society. We are unable. We have the inability to concentrate. We need to get back to a system where we can actually converse with people. Focus. But we'll use all sorts of excuses. Look at all the good I'm doing. Insert whatever it is. While our kids are suffering. Well, I do a pretty good job. Everyone is doing it. So let's look at morality and destiny. How should I live my life? What happens to me when I die? The Bible actually is really clear on this. Paul said, if there is no resurrection, then just go do whatever you want. And I think that's a great option. If what we believe isn't true, let's go party, because we're just going to be dead. But let's look at this idea of virtue in Scripture. His divine power has granted us all things that pertain to life and godliness through knowledge of him who created us into his own glory and excellence. This is 1 Peter 1. It's not on the screen. For this very reason, make every effort to supplement to your faith virtue. It's the same Greek word that Aristotle used, by the way. That's also excellence. Virtue and excellence, and a virtue knowledge. When we divorce this, all sorts of things happen. I went to the Department of Justice website, and they publish a lot of things. Now, what I want to make clear is lots of knowledge in the absence of morality leads to problems. And so these are brilliant doctors who did $250 million in fraud. So knowledge without objective morality turns a diploma into a license to loot. Now let's apply that to Congress. How do you go into Congress? Most of them know, albeit there's a few people who think Guam turned upside down. There's a few congressmen that are not the brightest. But in general, most of them are highly educated attorneys. They can go into Congress worth almost nothing and come out worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It is virtueless, but lots of knowledge. This one got me during COVID. I talked about it. Even during COVID, you could not criticize Pfizer. Do you know the single biggest healthcare fraud settlement in history? Why did Pfizer settle for $2.3 billion with a B? They settled because they were going to end up losing probably a lot more if they went through trial. And it was for fraudulent marketing. A decade later, what were we told? We cannot question the all-knowing Pfizer. We need to step back and have the ability to think. We don't need, there's these things called arguments from authority. That means somebody like myself might have a degree, and so you have to listen to what I say. Don't. It's interesting when you go to Acts. The unbelievers, they're not even Christians yet. In Acts 17, they listen, but then they want to go see what Paul is saying is true. Now, that happened to relate to Scripture. So, human flourishing, let's apply that to the verse we had. If we're a royal priest, a holy nation, all of these things, we proclaim the excellencies. That is the same Greek word as virtue. What are we proclaiming? And it also can be translated excellence as well of God. If there is any virtue or excellence, if there's any things, these are the things we should be doing. We have a family responsibility to teach these things. This is, I think, the foundation where it starts. It's the bottom rung. It is not school, it's not church, it starts in the family. That's the bottom rung. The Bible is clear to bring them up in the instruction of the Lord, teach them diligently. And it gives kind of a warning. And I think sometimes it's important when we study Scripture to understand sometimes when Jesus says something, like in Matthew 13, this is the parable of the seeds. He says the seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word at once and receives it with joy, but they have no root. They last a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they fall away. So that word, they fall away, stumble, fall away, is on the screen. The rocks have not been removed. Now, what does he say when he's talking about children? He goes, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believes in me to fall away. It's the exact same thing. These are people who are placing rocks. How many kids do we know in families who grow up, they last for a short time, but they have no root? The Bible's warnings is if you're causing these little ones to fall away, a millstone. We need to take this value of children so seriously. Do we value them too little? I would say we do. The Bible is clear over and over again. If we say, now there are other blessings in Scripture. I'm not saying there aren't, but if we say someone's blessed, we don't really mean that they have a lot of children. We mean they have a lot of money. I use this quote frequently from Adolf Hitler. He says, the state must proclaim the truth that the child is the most valuable possession a people can have. In this matter, the state must assert itself as a trustee of a millennial future, in the face of which egotistical desires of the individual account for nothing will have to give way before the ruling of the state. This is a worldview. Family doesn't matter, the state matters. You are something for the state to control. Now, Biden said something similar. There's no such thing as someone else's child. Our nation's children are all our children. No, they're not. The Bible directly contradicts that. But I would encourage parents in the church to insert themselves into this and to be able to say something like this: parents must proclaim the truth that children are the most valuable possession. In this matter, the family must assert itself as the trustee of the future, in the face of which mom and dad's egotistical desires count for nothing and will have to give way before proper discipleship of the God-giving blessing of children. I need my dad time. I need my mom time. What we see in Scripture is give everything to the discipleship of the next generation. One of the few things we get to do, just imagine that. If you could have a child that's impressive as Elon Musk or Donald Trump or builds a Great Wall of China, all of those things at some point disappear. There will be a day, if we live long enough, that the Great Wall of China will fall down. It's going to wear out. But when a man and a woman come together and create with God a human soul, they're creating something that lasts forever. And we trivialize this. And this, the sexual revolution, has cheapened that intimacy, that beauty, and has absolutely decimated this worldview around children. To where now, even from the pulpit, you hear people say, teenagers, you know, right? Like somehow they mock teenagers. This time of massive intellectual growth. Identity is being formed. Instead of going, no, this is the trustee of God's bride on the earth. Look at birth rate. It's plummeting. Absolutely is plummeted. You go to what was considered the most Christian nation, which was South Korea. South Korea per person sent out more missionaries than any other nation like in the last 30 years. It's not even close to the US. There are less than one child that's from 0 to 4 to replace those that are from 50 to 54. They have faced a point of no return. So a population graph is pretty simple. You have, for example, 1.3 million children that are 0 to 4 in Korea. Are there going to be less in the next category in 4 years from 4 to 8? Yes. Some children are going to die from disease or whatever. And as you go up that chart, it's going to be smaller and smaller. There are literally more 80 to 84-year-old girls in Korea than there are 0 to 4. That is a huge problem. We need to have a different view of children. Going back to this education model, again around gender and sexuality. Teachers who insist they're not teaching your kid about sex also weirdly outraged by a ban on teaching your kids about sex. Where are all the drag show nursing home shows? Right? They don't exist. Now, I'm super thankful. I feel like there's been a shift. I really do. Like some of this absurdity might be changing, and I'm excited about it, but we'll see. Look at the arrogance, though, of the Nebuchadnezzars and the Hitlers and insert whoever, how much they know this. Really, very little is gone from this playbook. When an opponent declares, I will not come over to your side, I calmly say, your child belongs to us already. Who are you? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in a new camp. In a short time, they'll know nothing else but this new community. Our love affair to get our children out of the house is straight from the Communist Manifesto. The education of all children, from the moment they can get along without a mother's care, shall be in state institutions at state expense. The quicker and earlier we can indoctrinate. Where is this coming from, though? But my pre-K teachers really nice. They actually are. But what they're learning at higher education is that motherhood isn't being taught as super valuable. What they are being taught is, hey, if we can teach them certain things, there will be certain positive outcomes. Let's go back to the 60s. This is 60 years ago. The barometer for judging the character of people in regard to human rights is now those who consider themselves gay, homosexual, and lesbian. The judgment as to whether you can trust the future, the social environment, depending on people, will be judged on where they come out on the gay, lesbian, homosexual question. I think this is, 62 years ago. By the way, Bayard Rustin marched with Martin Luther King. We just celebrated Martin Luther. So what we do is we create Ebenezer stones. In this case, we name schools after people like him. John Dewey said, there's no God, there's no soul. Hence, there are no needs for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, immutable truth is dead and buried. There is no room for fixed natural laws or moral absolutes. He's considered the father of modern education. So there we go. Horace Mann. What the church has been for medieval man, the public school must become for the democratic and rational man. God would be replaced by the concept of public good. So, do we have any Horace Mann elementary schools? Who in here is outside of education has heard of Horace Mann? That's how many Horace Mann schools we have. The Humanist Manifesto, John Dunphy, I think he said it about as succinctly as you can. I'm convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged in the public school classroom by teachers that correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity that recognizes the spark of what theologians call divinity in every human being. Have we heard that before? And you shall be as God. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and new, the rotting corpse of Christianity together with all its adjacent evils and misery. This was 52 years ago. It is being set up. These are, if you look at who are the shepherds? I would say the National Education Association, the NEA. The schools cannot allow parents to influence the kind of values education their children receive in school. That's what's wrong with those who say there's a universal system of values. Our, meaning their humanistic goals, are incompatible with theirs. We must change their values. What I love about people coming to a conference like this is there's actually is great hope. There's also amazing answers. When you learn a small amount of how beautiful the Bible is, how you were made with a purpose, you combine virtue with knowledge, a beautiful thing happens. Love comes out of that. Because what happens is you actually care about other people more than yourself. And that supreme ethic of love is what Jesus humbled himself and came here for. Love is what drives this. What we have going on in Arkansas is pretty spectacular. We're going to a system that money follows each student, but we still have the same problem in higher education. So these children that can even maybe grow up in a little bit better system that's going to be happening, what happens when they hit college? Is there any real solution? And I want to say definitively there is. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about Christian halls and a specific solution. This isn't theory. This isn't looking at history. This is, here is something you can get involved with tomorrow that will make an impact for multi-generations.